Rise and shine, history buffs. It's time for another episode of Monday Morning General. Here we give you the play-by-play analysis on battles from antiquity to the 20th century. I'm Brendan, hanging out with Bjorn, and over there we have a new face. What's up, Sam?
Hey everyone, how are you doing? I'm Sam, super happy to be here and excited to talk about Passchendaele today.
Glad to have you here. So yeah, giving away the lead, we are talking about the Battle of Passchendaele, or the Third Battle of Ypres, fought between the Allies, mostly the British, with a few French divisions against the German Empire on the Western Front of World War I. The battle took place from July to November of 1917 and was fought for control of the ridges south and east of the Belgian city of Ypres and West Flanders.
Yeah, so this is actually really important to understand here, Brendan, that all the battles we previously talked about, they've been a day. This one is 3 months. So this battle is going to take place over 3 months. It's really difficult when you're talking about World War I battles to break it down. They're more like campaigns, because there's going to be days where a lot happens and then there's going to be days where not so much happens. But the generally agreed upon idea is that this battle took place over a period of about 3 months over there in Belgium, the far western portion of Belgium.
You say it's like a campaign. It's a campaign in time only, but it is a battle in geographic circumstance. Like this battle is not on a large piece of terrain, right? So it is a battle in terms of geography, but but it's a battle fought over a long period.
I think to your point, I think the terrain itself is only like 12 miles north and south and about 5 miles east and west. And when we're going to talk about the casualties involved here, the sheer number of people here is astounding.
It is the biggest battle in terms of people that we've talked about so far on this.
By far.
So Bjorn, before we jump into getting into the historical context and providing some analysis here, before we get into the battle next episode, can you just give us a quick understanding of why this battle is interesting and something for us that we want to talk about?
Yeah, sure. So there's always times that people, they remember particular campaigns, particular battles during an entirety of a war. The Battle of Passchendaele, or the Third Battle of Ypres, is one of those that sits in the minds of a lot of individuals. We're going to see some really impressive occurrences, but more than anything, just the controversy that surrounds this battle is one of those that leave a lot of historians sitting there wondering, why in the world did this battle happen? Now, World War I, on the Western Front, we're going to see massive casualties on a grand scale. But generally speaking, you could look at that and you could say there was a reason why this battle was fought. Someone was attempting to gain something for a purpose more than just, killing off some of your enemy or maybe grabbing a foot or two of ground, which is really kind of the sad state of affairs here. What we're going to see here is a controversy surrounding two different things. When the Battle of Passchendaele kicks off, it's right on the heels of the Nivelle Offensive, which was organized by a French general, Robert Nivelle, and it was a complete and utter shambles. It was a tragedy. It was about a month long, and there were massive casualties on the French side. The British were involved. It was a disaster. It was so bad that the French armies decided to mutiny. They stopped fighting. They said, we will sit here in our trenches. We will not go over the top again. We will defend ourselves. We will defend France, but we will not move forward. That's a real problem to be in when you're trying to win a war, or when you're just trying to advance into your enemy's trenches and take some more territory. So that's one of the major questions, is why on the heels of something so devastating are the British so eager to continue the chaos? Well, secondly, this battle, the Battle of Passchendaele, is going to take place in the summer of 1917. This 4 months after the United States got involved in this war. We are not yet ready to go. The American army is not yet over there, but they're on their way. So why are the British so excited to throw more of their men away when they know that the Americans are on the way? So those two controversies really beg the question of, why in the world did the British think that this was a good idea?
And think about the mental toll that would take on the soldiers too. Like, that you're getting massive reinforcements from the United States. They just need a little bit of time to mobilize. And all of a sudden your command is telling you, hey, we need you to go and fight 250,000 Germans without these reinforcements, like especially coming off, like Bjorn had said, the Nivelle offensive. That just would be so disheartening. Like, I can't imagine putting myself in those shoes.
And what we're going to see when the battle actually kicks off is that the environment that they find themselves in, the terrain, and also the weather plays terribly into this.
It's almost as if God was against them.
Oh
Like,
yeah.
when you look at the weather, it was it's incredible how awful it was.
Yeah, and so just the thought behind what these soldiers are going through, what they're going to be doing, well, at the back of their mind, they're saying, "Why are we doing this? America is on the way over here."
And like you said, all for paltry gains, all for very paltry gains. I won't give away the lead, but it is sad.
Let's jump into historical context here. So, like Bjorn had said, this is the Third Battle of Ypres. So, there's been two other battles that have been fought in the vicinity of this little Belgium town. So, the first Battle of Ypres, fought in October to November of 1914, was fought in order to gain a local advantage after the race to the sea had formed. Right, so like this is like the last edge, the northern edge of the western. The other southern edge goes down to the Swiss Alps, and this is the last chance for the Germans or the British to get around the edge of the line and make a breakthrough. But a stalemate happened here back in 14. Staggering numbers of soldiers and 4.4 million Allied troops, 5.4 million German, over 130,000 German casualties, French casualties between 50 and 85,000. The British having 58,000 casualties, and the Belgian army having 21. So huge numbers already back in 1940. Gets us anything on that one?
Yeah. So for those listeners that don't understand the importance of gaining a flank, it's so the way the war was developing. Brendan had kind of mentioned the race to the sea. When you have a immovable object meeting an unstoppable force, like it just you need to get to the side so that you can attack an area that's softer. But so we saw the Allies and the Germans kind of racing to the sea. The sea wasn't necessarily the goal, but that flank was the goal, so that they could penetrate and soften up their opponent. And Ypres was kind of the tipping point where those two ends.
The edge was never achieved by either army.
It was never.
That brings us to the second Battle of Ypres back in April to May of 1915, which was fought for the tactically important high ground to the south of the Flemish Ypres. And the second Battle of Ypres was the first mass use by German poison gas. Bjorn. So at this point, like you hear like the horror stories of the gas just pouring into the trenches. What happened in the second Battle of Ypres?
Yeah, we need to take a tactical pause here. We need to delve a little bit deeper into this whole poison gas scenario. So remember, the battle, the area of Ypres in Belgium is a very influential position throughout the First World War, because the first time these kind of things happen are going to be, it's going to be monumental. So like the first Battle of Ypres, that's where the war stagnates, the race to the sea ends. Now we're entrenched. We're going to spend the rest of the war, or almost the rest of the war, in trenches. The second Battle of Ypres, we're going to see the Germans use poison gas for the first time on the Western Front. So on the 22nd of April, 1915, it's about 5 o'clock in the evening, the Fourth German Army is going to release 171 tons of chlorine gas on a 4-mile front. All right,
That's so much gas.
So much gas.
If you've never the French have no idea what this is. This scary green smoke coming out over the no man's land. That's horrifying.
Right, and here's how it's going to be. It's going to be delivered. The early forms of gas delivery systems were where the Germans would go to their front trenches. They would wait for the wind to blow in the right direction. They would open the canisters, and the smoke would have to billow across no man's land. So it's not it's not technical. It is not accurate. If the wind shifts, you're in real trouble. If you're getting
if it shifts east,
you're getting a backblast of that chlorine. But the Germans are going to release this gas on a 4-mile front between the hamlets of Langemarck and Grevenstedt. That's on the Allied line. It's held by French territorial and troop colonials. So they're Moroccan and Algerian troops of the French 45th and 87th Divisions. So the French are holding the line here when all of a sudden this cloud billows over them. Now, for the listeners, chlorine gas smells like a swimming pool. So that's essentially what it is, a very, very strong swimming pool smell, because it's chlorine, right? So instead of chlorine in a liquid or a solid form, they use the chlorine pellets when they put it in the swimming pool. It turns into, mixes with the water. It's in a liquid form. Instead, it's in a gas form. Now, the French troops, mass chaos. Like, imagine, you have no idea what the heck this is. The Germans had used poison gas on the Eastern Front before, but it wasn't poison gas. It was tear gas that they had mobilized against the Russians. The French troops are not ready for this. The path of cloud, it's going to cause about 2,000 to 3,000 casualties. About 800 to 1,400 of those individuals are going to die. Just straight up, they're going to drown in their own mucus. All right, this is nasty stuff. I got a quote here from a colonel Henri Murdoch, he's going to say, haggard, their overcoats thrown off or wide open, their scarves pulled up, running like madmen, directionless, shouting for water, spitting blood, some even rolling on the ground, making desperate efforts to breathe. Imagine, I mean, you could send soldiers in to a hail of gunfire. You could tell soldiers that they're going to have to run up against a tank, but to tell them that the air that they're breathing is poisonous to them, that's going to be a problem. I cannot imagine a situation like
That's
that.
horrible.
So completely chaotic. The French are gonna they're gonna break and run. There's a 4 mile gap in the lines, completely undefended. That breakthrough that Germany had been looking for has been achieved. The German infantry is going to be following behind this cloud of gas. They're going to be using cotton pads. Basically, think of like a big old bandage tied to their face that's been soaked with sodium thiosulfate solution. They're going to occupy the villages of Langemark and Pilkman, but then they're going to dig in. So they are not going to take advantage of this gap in the line. And that right there could be, you could argue that that's one of the big mistakes of this. The Germans and the English and the French during World War I, they're going to use something for the first time, and they're going to use it as like an experiment. And generally speaking, the first time they use it, it's massive results could have been obtained had they backed it up. But the Germans had very limited goals. Their goal was to utilize this poison gas and then advance a little bit. And that's what they did. Had their idea been, if we have the opportunity, we will push through as fast and as far as we can, they could have seen some major advances. But they're going to decide to dig in. They might have been able to occupy the city of Ypres almost unopposed. They took 2,000 prisoners. They captured 51 artillery pieces. The Canadian troops that were defending the southern flank of that break-in, they were able to identify that it was chlorine. They said it smelt like their drinking water because they were using chlorine in order to purify their drinking water. But the Germans are going to release more chlorine the next day, especially heavy casualties on that Canadian battalion that was involved. But it's going to be a massive opportunity that is going to be wasted.
Now, Bjorn, you can answer this question, hopefully. Was the use of chemical weapons technically banned at this time by the Universal Law of War?
I think Geneva came after that.
I know Geneva came after that, but there was some sort of precursor to Geneva. I believe it was in Russia.
It was the Hague.
The Hague. Thank you very much.
It was the Hague. No, it was the Hague Convention. It was in the early 1900s, late 1800s. It had been signed banning poison gas. It was in fact illegal, but when you are at a war for the very existence of your empire, as you see the losers saw their empires destroyed, they cast it aside. Poison gas was absolutely illegal according to modern war laws that had been signed only, a decade or two prior.
But what are you going to do, Sam? Go to war against me?
Right, exactly. So again, so something interesting that I may or may not be true, but I found to be interesting was during how I understand the Hague Convention and how the contract was written. Again, I haven't read it, but the use of poison gas in an artillery shell was what was banned, and it was thought that you needed to launch the artillery so that the gas would be away from you to use it. Yeah. And so in order to get through the loophole, that is why the Germans just simply released the lids on the barrels when the wind was just right, so that they could technically be within the law of war. That may or may not be true, but it is interesting to point out that the use of chemical weapons was banned by the Hague Convention.
Sam, you're spot on. It says the 1899 Hague Peace Convention, it basically says that it was an agreement to abstain from the use of projectiles, the sole object of which was the diffusion of asphyxiating or deleterious gases. So there you go.
The Germans are innocent.
Anything wrong? We just left these barrels out overnight.
Exactly.
Oh, we forgot to turn our tanks off. We were grilling and we forgot to turn off the gas.
The other thing that is interesting to me here, so Sam, you have a maneuver background, and can you imagine achieving a beautiful breakthrough? You have a 4-mile open stretch, and then you just stop right inside of that breakthrough.
It boggles the mind. It really does. Yeah. You have to wonder though, with this first use of chemical weapons, there's probably a lot of confusion. There's probably a lot of, is this area safe to enter? I don't know. Maybe they weren't thinking about that. Maybe they were, but I don't know. I mean, considering how important Ypres it was to both sides. It's hard to comprehend the fact that they didn't seize the initiative there.
But the crazy part about it is you can look throughout all of history where individuals, instead of taking the initiative, they do the safe thing because they've achieved their objectives. I mean, you see it
Almost
in
every conversation we've had so far, Bjorn, has had some sort of effect like
exactly. And when what Sam was talking about, the most glaringly obvious example in my mind is when the Germans invaded France during World War II, and then they stopped short of Dunkirk, and they could have had an outstanding victory. They could have bagged the whole lot of the British, but instead they let them all go because someone told them to stop. They had the initiative, they had the opportunity, and they stopped. That's exactly what's going to happen here. But I got one more quote about poison gas just for the listeners to really get excited about how terrible and how scary this is. So
excited, huh?
Lance Sergeant Elmer Cotton, he says, it produces a flooding of the lungs. It is an equivalent death to drowning only on dry land. The effects are these: a splitting headache and terrific thirst. To drink water is instant death. A knife edge of pain in the lungs and the coughing up of a greenish froth off the stomach and the lungs, ending finally in insensibility and death. The color of the skin from white turns a greenish black and yellow. The tongue protrudes and the eyes assume a glassy stare. It is a fiendish death to die. Oh,
And that coming from a guy named Elmer Cotton, man, what a World War I name that was.
so that's the Second Battle of Ypres. That took
Sounds
place.
terrible.
Remember that took place in 1915.
That was only 6 months after the first battle.
Yeah, and then everything kind of dies down the next year. In 1916,
and specifically in Ypres, like things
right.
get very exciting.
Absolutely nothing died down in the Western Front.
Okay, all right. Actually, minor note here: a regular day on the Western Front where no major battles were taking place, they still had casualties, obviously, and they would call those casualties wastage. And it was a good day if on the Western Front you suffered only 5,000 casualties due to wastage every day. 5,000 every day. That was a good day. So in 1916, in the Ypres salient, there's going to be very limited operations. You're going to see some German initiatives to distract the Allies from the preparations for their offensive at Verdun. Because remember, the Germans are going to be throwing everything that they have in 1916 at Verdun in France. It's that pocket of fortresses in eastern France.
We'll definitely talk.
You guys
about
will
Verdun
have to do an episode on Verdun at some point. That is just
we will get Verdun and the.
Well, and so Verdun is an 11-month-long battle. It took place, started in February of 1916, goes till December. So obviously, if the Germans have all of their attention in Verdun, there's going to be very limited things that they're going to have the strength to do in Ypres. At the same time, the French are going to be in a similar situation. But if you recall, the French ran into such a terrible scenario in Verdun that they were crying to the British to relieve some of the pressure on them. They said, Brits, we need you to do an offensive, start bogging down the Germans somewhere else. The Germans are going to choose the Somme. So that's why during 1916, we're going to see major German and British and French conflicts in Verdun and at the Somme, and not in Passchendaele, not in Ypres. So other operations are going to be begun to try and regain territory or to grab some specific ground that was like very advantageous. We can talk about ridge lines and hills later on as to why those would be necessary. Actually, nothing major happens in 1917. So then we get to 1917 where things finally start to move in the northern front. Let's talk real quick about why Ypres. Why did the British focus in on the northern portion of the Western Front? Why did they focus on Belgium? And it's really important for a couple different reasons. First, on the 1st of February 1917, the Germans are going to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. And so the impetus on the British to clear out those Belgian coastlines for the use of the German submarines, they had to get them out of there. If the French and the British can recapture Belgium, that deprives them of the coastline that they were previously using to house their submarines, their U-boats. All right, so number one idea, deprive the Germans of the ability to utilize their U-boats in a close area to the British shipping lanes, right? Because otherwise they have to go from Wilhelmshaven and Kiel, which is over there in Germany, and those boats would have to sail a longer distance. All right, so now we were talking about Ypres. It basically derives from two different things. First of all, we got to keep the Germans occupied. Now, they had an original agreement here with the Russians in the Kerensky offensive that the Russians were going to initiate an offensive in November of 1916. They make this agreement, and the Russians are going to do everything that they can to distract the Germans. As the Germans are being distracted, that means that now the British and the French have to take the initiative. They have to use that advantage that the Russians are so expensively paying for. Because if you remember, the Russians are not very good at conducting offensive operations. There's only going to be one really impressive offensive operation during the entirety of the war that the Russians are going to conduct. And by the end, when that one offensive takes place, they are not going to be able to roll that up and sustain that. That's the Brusilov offensive is going to take place. That's the one good battle that takes place that the Russians lead on the Eastern Front. So the Russians here, they're distracting the Germans. So now the French and the British have to take the initiative. They have to go. There's a dude, his name's General Robert Nivelle. We've talked about him before, but he's the dude who's now got this idea. And the idea is we're going to overwhelm the German lines with artillery. We're going to pound the snot out of them. We're going to give them everything that we have. And at that point in time, we're going to give them everything that we have. We're going to send everyone. And it is going to be massively devastating. Now, Nivelle thought this was a great idea, but the British general, Sir Douglas Haig, thinks it's not going to work because why would it? It's not worked before. So he's going to have reservations. His reservations are, if this does not work, we're going to do a timeout real quick, and we are going to change our focus to the north, because remember, we need to capture the Belgian coast. So the British had made that agreement with the French. We'll fight you the way you want to fight. We'll do your Nivelle offensive. If it doesn't work, then we're out. And what do you know? The offensive goes from the 9th of April to the 9th of May, and it doesn't work. Catastrophic casualties. Or there are a couple initial gains. I mean, you pound the snot out of the German front lines, they're not going to be able to hold. That's just not the way it's going to work. But it doesn't have the results they expected. And so Douglas Haig changes direction. He says, we're going north, we're going to Belgium, and we're going to fight in Ypres.
All right, let's talk about Field Marshal Douglas Haig. He's the first Earl of Haig. He commanded the British Expeditionary Force in the Western Front from late 1915 until the end of the war. He was commander during the Battle of the Somme, the Battle of Arras, the Third Battle of Ypres, the German Spring Offensive, and the 100 Days Offensive. Haig is widely criticized for his leadership during the first. He was nicknamed Butcher Haig. The 2 million British casualties endured under him. The Canadian War Museum comments, his epic but costly offensives at the Somme and Passchendaele have become nearly synonymous with the carnage and futility First World War battle. Since the 1980s, many historians have argued that the public hatred with which Haig's name had come to be associated failed to recognize the adoption of new tactics and technologies by forces under his command, the important role played by British forces in the Allied victory of 1918, and that high casualties were a consequence of the tactical Butcher Haig. Not a great name to have as a general.
Definitely not. But when you're looking at it, you have to understand that he was in charge for a really long time, 1915 until the end of the war. So obviously he's going to have a lot of casualties that are going to be sustained. He was originally thought to be a pretty unimaginative leader, unimaginative commander. But then you have to think about it. Between 1915 and 1918, the British are going to utilize tanks for the first time to great success. They're going to implement those guys on the battlefield. They're going to implement a lot of new creeping barrages, artillery, bombardment styles. They're going to utilize gas warfare. They're going to adopt a lot of new modern war ideas during his tenure in command. So,
I think adopt is probably inaccurate. I think it's more like invent on the fly. Like how do we solve this problem? And a lot of times, especially for Haig, that answer was let's fire artillery at it. Like at the Battle of the Somme, they were firing 10,000 shells a day, and that was Haig's baby. And so that was kind of like let's do it, and let's kind of overdo it and just see if that solves the problem. Throw it all at the wall and see what sticks. And that was Haig.
That was Haig. But also sending his men over at the Somme and having the largest casualties in a single day. Dudes walked across the battlefield with a soccer ball because they thought the amount of artillery that we've expended on the German lines, there can't possibly be anyone left alive. Turns out the Germans were a little bit better at building their trenches.
Right. And so continuing to just throw something like artillery at a problem that artillery is not solving, that's how generals get bad reputations by just continuing to do something that isn't working, and then dudes are dying in crazy numbers.
So that's the Allied side. Let's talk about the German side. So on the leading the German army here is Erich Friedrich Wilhelm Ludendorff. Following his appointment as first quartermaster general of the Imperial Army's Great General Staff in 19, he became the chief policymaker and a de facto military dictatorship that dominated for the rest of them. And Bjorn, we'll get more into this a little bit, but so Ludendorff kind of comes up with this great defense and depth strategy, right? To give the Germans some depth to their defense, so it's not just focusing on the one trench line. So let's talk about that. Like as we jump into the tactical view here, let's talk about the Germans' defense and depth strategy that loops together here.
Sure. So quick run through the tactics. Everyone's got this idea in their mind. It's a modern war, right? So for the first time, we're seeing machine guns. We're seeing chemical warfare. We're seeing airplanes utilized for the first time in combat. You've
Large
got
amounts of artillery, concertina wire,
artillery.
gas. Yeah.
It's all there. When you're going to attack, you're in your trenches. Your trench could be anywhere between 50 and 500 meters away from your opponent's line. You've got listening posts, LPOPs. You've got observation posts in the center.
Nice acronym.
Thanks, man. You're digging mines underneath your opponent's trenches. You're putting dynamite in there. You're utilizing every idea that has been and every idea that you think will be in order to destroy your enemy's trenches. Now, if there was only one single line of trenches and you bust through that line, well, then you're golden. And there were a couple opportunities, like we saw with the utilization of poison gas, where there was a massive hole that was busted through the lines. But Erich Ludendorff, now, he is going to start the war. He's going to do a really great job of capturing the fortress at Liège. He's going to then get taken over to the Eastern Front with a guy named Hindenburg, and they're going to have a massive victory at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. They're going to do great things in the East, and they're going to do so well that they're going to be placed in overall command of the German military forces. Well, Hindenburg was kind of the figurehead. Ludendorff was the one who was working nonstop. And he creates this idea of a defense in depth. So essentially the idea behind it is that you're going to...
Hindenburg got the namesake for the Hindenburg line, but it was Ludendorff's idea.
Oh, yeah. Hindenburg was this figurehead. He was this old dude who had been brought out of retirement because he was famous or something. And like he would take naps. Well, Ludendorff literally never slept. The guy was nuts. And he comes up with this idea that you, instead of just having one stiff, solid line, you need to delay your enemy and prevent their advance by buying time and causing additional casualties by yielding space. So you've got your front line, you have your secondary line, you have your tertiary lines, you've got machine gun positions strategically placed throughout the entirety of that. Instead of defending one single line with a very strong defense, you are going to allow your enemy to penetrate while falling back as they're wasting their lives, as they're wasting their energies and their ammunition. You are buying yourself time. You're creating space for a counter.
And you're that space you're creating. You're like the Germans are falling back to advantageous positions that they have set up for themselves specifically. Basically, they're luring the British and the French into the really nice little salients for them to be surrounded by Germans. Right,
Absolutely.
That's what's happening. Yeah.
Yeah. Throughout the entire war, the Germans are going to have very good defensive capabilities, defensive tactics. That defense in depth is going to be their idea. But then at the same time, they're going to have spectacular offensive capabilities with their creation of the stormtrooper and that concept of, instead of trying to capture all the territory, your job is to infiltrate. And if there's a pocket of resistance, go around. Just go around, get through the line, punch through the line, create chaos in the rear, and get moving. That's their idea.
It's kind of wild. I know Ludendorff is a German. He's the baddie, and we're supposed to not lie. I like Ludendorff a lot. He's kind of a guy that made it on his own. This whole defense and depth thing is something that we still use today. Like it is the way Ludendorff laid it out is how modern defenses are still done today, and it's pretty cool. The legacy that he built for himself. Again, wasn't fighting for the Allies, but he was a very smart guy that deserves the credit.
Or surprisingly, like one of the things that we still retain from one in terms of like strategies and like how to actually. So that's a defensive side, Bjorn. How are the British going to be attacking into this line that Ludendorff set up at Ypres?
Right. So this is it's a salient. So for those who don't know what a salient is, it's basically a bulge in the line. So you would like your lines to be as straight as possible because that means you're using the minimum amount of soldiers to defend that line.
Are the British
Well,
in the bulge, or are the Germans in the bulge?
the British are in this bulge. The
Okay.
British are holding the city of Ypres and then around to the north and all the way to the south on a three-way kind of a semicircle. You are seeing the Germans on three sides. Now, the British are the ones who are holding these amazing hills, and so they're going to want to hang on to them. And the Germans are going to want to take these hills away. But here's the thing: the British have prepared very well for an operation in Belgium. Now, they've built railroads. Now, you guys know me, I'm a logistics guy. I like the rails, I like the roads. I want to make sure that you've got as much ammunition and fuel and food as you possibly need. And the British, beginning in 1915, started doubling their rail lines into that portion of Belgium. So they've got double rails. They're capable of pushing massive amounts of resources into this area to sustain an operation. All right. Not only that, but they begin to utilize actual planning to the idea of how can we utilize our offensive resources that are available to us using the terrain that we have along with a likely German defense. So, Brendan, with the MI stuff, what do we call that today? Is that MDMP?
So that's the military decision making process. How we go through creating plans.
So
Not really an MI thing. It's like a whole army thing. Yeah.
that's a whole army thing, right? Yeah, we just did MDMP the other month, but so we're using the British are using this military decision making process. They're evaluating the terrain, they're evaluating the resources that they have, what they think the most likely course of action that the Germans are going to utilize in order to defend that area. In early 1916, they decide that there's this importance on capturing this plateau that the Germans are holding on to. They need to advance further north. It's emphasized by Haig and all the Army of Commanders that this is what's going to happen. They're going to decide. First, there's this guy, he's Colonel Norman McMullen of the general headquarters. He's going to have this great idea. He's saying, hey, we should use this mass tank attack in order to capture this, which would reduce our need for artillery. Well, great idea, Norman, except for the fact that this area completely unsuitable for tanks. And what we're going to see with regard to the weather, as Sam has alluded, a tank would have absolutely no chance here. So it's a good thing that the British didn't attempt to utilize tanks and that they had done their reconnaissance prior to. Now, Brendan, that's something that we've seen a failure to do many times in the past, but the British are going to successfully recon the area and make a good decision. Now, there's this battle that takes place prior to the initiation of the battle, the Third Battle of Ypres. It's called the Battle of Messines Ridge, and this was a monster mine-laying, mine-digging operation. They are going to dig underneath the German trenches, and they're going to pack them full of explosives, and they're going to blow them to smithereens. But as soon as that ignition happens, and it's just south of Passchendaele, it's just south of the ridge line there, as soon as that kind of kicks off, the Third Battle of Ypres is on the way. All right, so the Germans, they're going to be anxious that the British are trying to exploit the victory of the Battle of Messines. So remember those explosive mines. The Germans, remember, they've got this defense in depth, and they're going to have this argument between Ludendorff, the Crown Prince Ruprecht, and this dude named General Fitz von Lossberg, who's the chief of staff of the Fourth Army. These guys are going to be discussing which lines do we abandon, what ground do we withdraw from, and which do we hold. And there were some, you've got the Crown Prince Ruprecht, who's proposing a withdrawal to the Flandern line, which is actually their third line of defense. But Lossberg is going to say, no, we're holding. We're going to hold where we are. And so they've got all sorts of lines. Remember, we said this defense in depth. They've got their front position. They've got their Albrechtstellung, which is their second position. Their Williamsstellung, which is the third position. Fandern Einstellung, Fandern Zweistellung, Fanders Dreistellung. They've got all these positions, and they refuse to withdraw from them.
So that's just like showing you how deep this thing is, right? I think what was that, like 6 different defensive positions, defensive lines here? That is an insane thing for the British to try to figure out a way to break through 7 different defensive lines.
Absolutely. Now, we talked about this, the Battle of Messines Ridge. The Germans on the ridge had observation over Ypres, and unless it was captured, they would have enfilading artillery fire, could be fired from against any British attack that's coming from the salient further north. So the British had been mining since mid-1915. They've been digging under the German positions on the ridge. By June 1917, there were 21 mines that had been filled with nearly 1 million pounds of explosive. The Germans, they knew the British were mining. They had been using countermeasures to try and to defeat these mines, but to no avail. All but two of the mines are going to detonate on the 7th of June at 3:10 a.m. Monstrous explosions. If you go there today, if you go to Ypres today, you can go just south of the town and you can see these they're huge, massive craters that were left from these. I've actually looked into one and I thought, man, if I fell into this thing, I'd never get out. And it's like a canyon. It is insane.
Wow.
And so basically,
just imagine again being a soldier there when that thing detonates. Like, what are you gonna do when 1 million pounds of explosives detonate underneath the ground? Like, man,
die.
You know what you're gonna do?
Yes, you die.
Yeah, you're gonna die, and you're gonna lose your dominating position on that ridge, which is what the Germans are gonna do. And the First Battle of Ypres kicks off with the massive explosions of these.
Third battle.
So again, the timeline I think here is important because it was June 7th that these detonated, but they didn't get approval for the battle until the 25th of June.
Yeah. So the Battle of the Messines Ridge, that was a conversation that happened prior to. So the Battle of Ypres, the Third Battle of Ypres, is not supposed to kick off until after these mines had been destroyed.
Okay, but so this was the end of the last battle.
That's right. So the Battle of Messines Ridge kicks off the Third Battle of Ypres. But we'll get into that next.
All right, Bjorn, thanks for that deep dive here leading in. We knew we were going to get ourselves into a little tangle here, these large World War I battles. So I'm glad we're jumping into it here. Sam, really appreciate you joining us, man. That's fun. So hopefully you can join us again for the next one to actually get into the details of the battle here. Oh, man, that's a lot of explosive, Bjorn. What did you say, 1 million pounds?
1 million pounds. 1 million pounds. But then on top of that,
it's hard to comprehend, like the numbers when you talk. Like we just got done, Sam, talking about Trenton and Princeton from the Revolutionary War last time, and it's like 1,000 guys.
Yeah,
it is like so small. Like George Washington running around the woods with like the scale. It's massive. It's hard. It's massive. Like thinking of the universe, right? Like you can't even think about the universe.
Yeah.
So thinking about 1 million pounds of explosive.
We're looking at 48 square miles that's going to hold 1 million people at a time. It's crazy, all with shells flying and mud, and that just goes to show how important Ypres is to both sides. Like Bjorn had talked about, it's the Belgian the access to the Belgian coast for the Germans, and it is the salient for the British, and they're trying to defend it. Yeah. So it's just each of them are trying to not get outflanked. So it's just a very interesting piece of terrain for both sides.
All right, so next time we are going to talk about the terrain around Passchendaele. We're going to talk about the weather. We talked about how the weather is affected, so we're going to get some more details on the weather. We're going to talk about who actually fought here, so we're going to get you some numbers, and then we're going to give you an in-depth play-by-play of what actually happened here at the Third Battle of Ypres, and then we'll do a little analysis, conclusion there, and then we'll jump into our next series. So everyone, thank you so much for joining us. We will see you 2 weeks from now.